Over these past few days, as I've been totally saturated with all this AI slop for this video, it's begun to actually change the way my mind's eye visualizes history. And when I think of anything history related, this sort of glossy, uncanny image is the first thing that comes to mind. But I don't want history to just be brain rot, man. That can't happen. And it's not just that these AI videos completely screw up the historically accurate look of the figures they talk about, because, humans do that too. It's also the fact that most of the time, the fun facts they pass off as real history are just baseless modern rumors. Or there's a little grain of truth to them, but the downright bizarre ways in which they're presented, combined with all the crucial context they omit, arguably does more harm than good. And hey, I'm a little guilty of this myself. Some of you longtime viewers might remember that this channel first blew up because I jumped on the AI art trend pretty early on. And even though I did mainly try to use it to make shit posts, and it's still a pretty good way to make them, I do have to admit that I used it in attempts at illustrating real history multiple times. And I can see why people use it. It's a cheap, easy way to illustrate super specific things that don't match up 100% with currently existing human art. Or photographs. But that's exactly the reason why I'm so against it now. None of it's real. And history is all about reality and real people that really existed, like you and I. And that's why I think that no matter how advanced AI art gets, it just shouldn't be involved with history. So today I'm going to be going through and debunking some especially egregious AI history slop on YouTube Shorts, and telling you the full stories behind the weird fun facts they pass off as history. So hopefully we can actually learn something while wading through all this slop. There are obviously tons more of these on Facebook and Twitter and stuff, but we'll get to that another day if this video does well enough. Let's start with this video from Jabril Sagas with 5.8 million views and 336,000 likes, so I'm definitely punching up here. This channel seems to mainly spout Snapple Cap type history fun facts, but a lot of the time they're nothing but modern rumors based on misinterpretations of real history. As you'd expect, the thumbnails are all pretty clickbaity and sort of raunchy, and probably unintentionally, the AI visuals are almost always extremely misleading, as we'll see.
Weird and bizarre history facts you won't learn anywhere else.
I don't know if anyone else thinks this, but I hate listening to AI voices. I don't want to hear robot scam callers in my entertainment,
Egyptian pharaohs would publicly masturbate into the Nile as a religious ceremony to guarantee good harvest. Afterwards, other men would follow the pharaoh and also ejaculate into the Nile.
Gotta love that sploosh they added. Okay, so is this true? No, it's not. Okay, so I've seen the claim that there was a certain ritual in ancient Egypt where pharaohs publicly jorked it into the Nile all over the internet for ages, but never with any real basis or much detail, though sometimes it's supplemented with details like the pharaoh made sure the and followed the flow of the river's waters, and that it was meant to mirror a variant of the Egyptian creation story where the creator god Atum created the first other gods, the gods of air, Shu, and the goddess of acidic moisture, Tefnut, by, let's say, rubbing his staff of Ra. There's another variant where it comes from his spit. And that's true, but this Pharaoh Gunnar ritual is a complete myth. For example, when Egyptologist Jonathan Winterman was asked about it, he replied, "To my knowledge, there is absolutely no evidence that the king ever publicly it into the Nile." The earliest reference to it I could find is from a 2004 book written by one Jonathan Margulis entitled "Oh, the Intimate History of the Bleep," where he claims it was an annual ritual meant to bring fertility to the Nile, and argues that the Atum myth was a post-rationalization of the actual ritual. It also says civil servants and even ordinary citizens are now believed to have aspired to live as sensual as their kings, and that evil Victorian archaeologists hid away all the evidence of that, which might be why this slop video says,
Afterwards, other men would follow the pharaoh and also ejaculate into the Nile.
There was a fertility god with a perpetually erect named Min, who was syncretized with the head of the Egyptian pantheon, at least during the New Kingdom, Amun, so it's possible that this story is loosely based on the rituals done for him. Like, there's one called the Coming Forth, or Going Out of Min, which is spelled this way in transcribed hieroglyphs, which was a harvest festival depicted in great detail on the walls of temples in Thebes like Medinet Habu and the Ramesseum, though Min was also the patron gods of two other Upper Egyptian cities, Akhmim and Koptos. You might remember that in my Narmer video, I mentioned how Narmer erected these two interesting colossal statues of the god at Koptos, but the only member on display during this harvest festival was that of the god's idol. For the pharaoh, it was a very serious religious occasion. For him, it only involved giving offerings to the god's statue, like his favorite food, lettuce. In fact, his altar is depicted as a garden plot with lettuce growing out of it, supervising people carrying the statue around, ritually cutting a sheaf of wheat in front of the statue with a sickle, and releasing 4 birds to the 4 corners of the world for whatever reason. I have no idea why. But I can tell you a real fun fact about Min. Egyptian lettuce was probably associated with Min because in addition to sort of resembling a phallus, it also contains lots of white sap of the same sort you can see if you cut the butt off romaine lettuce. But whatever, we've spent too much time on this. So in conclusion, there are 0 depictions of ancient Egyptian pharaohs touching their staves of rot, okay? Alright, let's see what's next.
In 897, the former pope, who had been dead for 7 months, was dug up and put on trial for perjury and heresy. He was convicted. I guess he had some grave sins to atone.
First thing, the dead pope mentioned here is named Pope Formosus. He was pope from 891 to 896, and the story of this cadaver synod, as it's called, is understandably pretty popular because of how bizarre it is. But the thing is, the details surrounding it are pretty murky, and the story of it seems to have been a bit embellished. The standard story, which comes from an unfortunately unreliable 10th century historian named Liutprand of Cremona, goes like this. Soon after Formosus' death, one of his successors, Sergius III, wanted to discredit him because back in 891 they'd fought over who was the rightful pope, and he thought that Formosus had usurped the throne from him. So he had Formosus' rotting corpse exhumed, propped up on the papal throne, and dressed in his official ecclesiastical robes. The part about having a deacon speak on the dead pope's behalf, which is a pretty common element of most tellings of the story, isn't included, and Liutprand mainly frames it as Sergius's excuse to taunt Formosus' corpse by saying, "Seeing that you are Bishop of Porto, why were you so inflated with ambition to claim what he saw as the worldwide see of Rome?" Because he saw Formosus as only rightfully being bishop of his original bishopric, Porto. Afterwards, Sergius declared all of Formosus' acts as pope void, cut off the 3 fingers he used to give benedictions, dressed the body in rags, and dumped it in the Tiber, like many an unwanted Roman emperor. But later on, Formosus' body was found by fishermen and taken to the old St. Peter's Basilica by Pope Theodore II, who himself only lasted 20 days on the throne. And Liutprand reports that as it lay there in its coffin, images of certain saints came to life and started saluting him. So what a nice happy ending. But the thing is, some authors say that Liutprand's account is usually regarded as all but worthless in historical terms, because he maybe deliberately misidentified the pope that dug Formosus up. He says it was Sergius III, but he only became pope in 904, 7 years after this happened, whereas a more contemporary chronicle, the Annals of Fulda, tell us that it was actually Pope Stephen VI, who reigned from 896 to 897, before being thrown in jail and strangled, which it was par for the course at the time. Things were getting pretty crazy. The Carolingian Empire had just sort of collapsed, so everything was sort of in flux. The Annals of Fulda mention that Formosus was exhumed, but omits mention of the trial. It explains that he died on Easter, oddly enough. Given current circumstances, his successor, Boniface, had gout, so he only lasted 15 days, and then afterwards, Stephen had him thrown out of his tomb, which is followed by the strange line, and by the advocate of his response ordered outside the usual place of the apostolic burial. Weirdly, another contemporary chronicler named Regino, abbot of Prum, completely omits any mention of this, but does mention that Formosus crowned Arnulf of Carinthia Holy Roman Emperor the year earlier in 896. So, I know these names sound background made up, but these are real people that existed somehow. So I think all we can be absolutely certain of is that Formosus was dishonored and exhumed soon after his demise, but then eventually it was taken back to St. Peter's since the official plaque listing all the popes buried there still includes it. It's possible that Liutprand conflated Stephen with Sergius because Sergius was infamously amorous and involved with the pornocracy, the period when the popes were supposedly controlled by powerful Roman noblewomen, so Liutprand was maybe trying to further emphasize how bad Sergius was, though there is some kernel of truth to this. Also, second thing, despite how ancient the papacy is, just because modern popes look sorta like this doesn't even look close to what popes looked like back then. This is reflected pretty well by actual human-made illustrations of the Cadaver Synod, like this famous one by 19th century French artist Jean-Paul Lorrain, which, also depicts the actual event described and not just monstrous headshots of fake people summoned from the ether, and on top of that, it's filled with nice, interesting little details, so it's actually worth looking at for more than 1 nanosecond. The uncanny and entirely different AI popes here that are all somehow supposed to represent Formosus are wearing the hats modern popes wear, called zucchetto or solideo, and those little elbow-length capes around their shoulders are called mozzetta. The mozzetta probably only came into use in the latter Middle Ages, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, maybe more specifically the latter 15th century. The zucchetto was probably created to cover and warm up tonsured clergymen's heads in cold churches around the 13th century, when it starts appearing in church frescoes, also according to the Catholic Encyclopedia. And though there don't seem to be any surviving contemporary depictions of Formosus himself, there are actually some surviving depictions of what 9th century popes looked like, and I found 2 of them. There's this really interesting monument in Rome called the Triclinium Leoninum, which depicts Pope Leo III and Charlemagne at the feet of St. Peter. Admittedly, it is an 18th century replica, but it seems to be faithful to the original. I mean, just look at Charlemagne's little mustache. The genuinely 9th century mosaics in Santa Prassede, sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, depicts the 9th century Pope Paschal I with a neat square halo used to depict the living at the time, handing a church to Christ during the Second Coming. I don't know why they're both orange, but I don't know, I guess I liked orange at the time. And as you can see, they're just far, far more interesting to look at compared to these AI monstrosities. And not that hard to find, honestly. Okay, let's move on.
The entire state of Ohio had only 2 cars. Both cars managed to still crash into each other.
So just like the Pharaonic Gooning one, this is yet another weird, apocryphal, i.e. fake story. There's just no mention of it in contemporary newspapers, despite how big of a story it obviously would have been at the time, with cars being such a rare novelty. But the first real automobile accident in Ohio actually occurred even earlier in 1891, when an inventor guy named James William Lambert, based out of Ohio City, which is a real place apparently, but ironically it's a village now, crashed there during a test run of what was arguably the first gasoline-powered automobile, known as the Buckeye Gasoline Buggy. It hit a tree root and then careened into a hitching post for a horse, ironically. But this 1895 rumor seems to stem from a 1967 ad for Mobil Gasoline, published in Life magazine, where it's just used as a hook to make a long-winded point ensuring consumers that more cars on the road won't equal more accidents, because gas company. Okay, let's move on.
Many of the streets in California are named after prostitutes.
Okay, so this deliberately saucy AI pinup girl, which you see in the thumbnail, looks like she's from 50s LA, but this is actually referring to the long-standing claim that streets in San Francisco were named after prostitutes from ye old Wild West Gold Rush days, so the 1840s and early 1850s. It's yet another common but very murky myth, though it does actually have a kernel of truth to it. Some supposed examples of this include Jesse Street, Fella Place on Nob Hill, I shit you not, Harriet Street, Bernice Street, Tahama Street, Natoma Street, Mina Street, Clementina Street, etc. But this is heavily debated, and one local historian named Liza Ruth Elliott argues that they're actually the names of ships, because San Francisco was and is a major port city, and she's found references to such ships from around when the streets got their names, like this one named named Jesse from March 1851. Mina Street was also rumored to be named after an unfortunate child streetwalker active in the 1870s who actually befriended Emperor Norton named Mina Ray Simpson, and it's said that the street was named by a politician who unfortunately used her. But that can't be true because there are references to it from as early as the 1850s. I did find one specific street which is actually named after a woman from the Gold Rush with an incredibly interesting and historically important story. Cora Street. It's named after the pseudonym for a woman named Claire Bell, or Arabella Ryan, who took the pseudonym Belle Cora. After arriving in San Francisco in 1849, she went from being a prostitute to running her own incredibly opulent parlor house/brothel that was very popular with the city's upper crust and which she operated with her beloved common-law husband, a high-stakes gambler named Charles Cora. So the parlor house was dubbed Cora House. But it all started to fall apart when U.S. Marshal William Richardson's wife happened to throw a party the same night that Belle Cora threw a party. And since Belle Cora's party had way more guests than hers, Richardson's wife was outraged. Then the couples accidentally ran into each other when they were seated in the same balcony in the theater. The Richardsons wanted them kicked out, but the management refused, and so they left instead. William may have insulted Belle, and some sort of tension definitely arose between the two men, because soon afterwards, Charles Cora shot Richardson dead. The murder of another guy at the same time got everyone really heated and baying for blood. Despite Belle Cora paying $15,000 in gold to a well-known lawyer, Edward Dickinson Baker, to argue that it was a case of self-defense, trying to bribe a witness, and sending Charles fresh food and laundry to his cell every day, Charles Cora was eventually hung. And from the second story of this place called Fort Gunnybags, very publicly in this huge spectacle ran by a glorified mob called the Committee of Vigilance on May 22nd, 1856. Just hours before the execution, Belle Cora officially married Charles in his holding cell, and afterwards she had him buried in a silver-trimmed mahogany coffin. Later, Belle devoted herself to philanthropy, but she unfortunately succumbed to pneumonia in 1862 at the age of 30 or 35. But way later, in 1916, she was reburied with Charles under the same lavish headstone in Mission Dolores Cemetery as she had originally intended. And for the final fact, we're returning to ancient Egypt.
In ancient Egypt, people used to shave off their eyebrows when their cats died as a sign of mourning.
The idea that the ancient Egyptians shaved off their eyebrows to mourn their dead cats is another extremely common fun fact I've seen tons of times throughout these Slop videos, but which I've also just encountered randomly across the internet and even in pop nonfiction books on ancient Egypt. And that's because this is actually a real fun fact, because it's reported by Herodotus, who actually personally visited Egypt in the 5th century BC. Some people call him the father of lies, but he's been proven right again and again, and he's my guy, so I think this is probably true. In Book 2 of his histories, he writes that the occupants of a house where a cat has died a natural death shave their eyebrows, and no more. On the death of a dog, they shave the head and the whole of the body. So if you take the whole quote into consideration, it seems to actually imply that dogs were more important to the ancient Egyptians, but regardless, we know that both animals were intimately associated with various gods. Cats were associated with Bastet and Sekhmet, and dogs were associated with Wepwawet and Anubis. And both animals were mummified and often given very lavish burials and memorials in their honor. So as usual, it's time to thank my esteemed patrons, starting with Dhruv Singhal, Bajun, Harrison Timperley, Doc Bossman, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bomb Tombadil, Danny Banani, Rose Klein, James Kirk, Booga420, Alyssa P., Mark Elliott Cullen, Chemek Wierzbicki, Jack Lester, Mithridates, Jake the Snake, Liv Buller, Tyler Doucette, Inbred Cat, Have a Cigar, Alex Clark, Jess Sullivan, Akyune, Mark Krupnik, Miha Nedog, Michael, Daisies for Ghosts, Kalen P., Julie Lau, Zafiro, Bean, Rito, The Spoofer, Emily Cujo, who I unfortunately forgot last time, Stevan, Greifenfrost, Hippolyta, Magna de Broiker, Julia Erickson, JP, Van Splendor, My Boy, Joseph Talley, Petra S., Generic Brand, Ryan Gregg, Skiku, My Other Boy, Ellen Fields, Brandon Wood, Giovanna Lazzarini, and Patrick Darius Gromodka. Thank you so much, and goodbye.